Good evening and welcome. You're watching this special edition of India Upfront because today indeed was a special day not just for Bharat but for world diplomacy. As promised by the Prime Minister and his team before the start of the G20 summit, India's presidency is proving to be path-breaking, historic and high, not on rhetoric but on delivery. In what is being seen as a highly ambitious summit, all the three pledges, decisive, inclusive and action-oriented, have been fulfilled. The biggest highlight, however, is the consensus clinched on a joint declaration. Remember, before this summit began, there were hundreds and thousands of naysayers. Several countries who were smirking at India's presidency, saying that a joint declaration is next to impossible. However, Prime Minister Modi announced that the G20 has officially adopted the New Delhi Leaders Summit Declaration and there was a 100% consensus on it. This is far-reaching as it signals that negotiators have resolved deep differences between Russia and China over the wording, especially on the war in Ukraine. Times Now was the first channel to get a word-by-word detailing of the reworded statement before the Prime Minister credited the hard work of his team for this massive breakthrough.
एक खुशखबरी मिली है हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर्स समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है कि इस लीडर्स डिक्लेरेशन को भी एडॉप्ट किया जाए। मैं इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडॉप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं।
Living up to its vow of amplifying the voice of Global South, India as G20 president also successfully pushed engagement with the African Union, bringing it to the G24. Prime Minister called it a step that further solidifies India's collective commitment to global progress and to ensure that platforms remain not just a talk shop but become representative and, most importantly, inclusive.
सबका साथ की भावना से ही भारत ने प्रस्ताव रखा था कि अफ्रीकन यूनियन को G20 की स्थायी सदस्यता दी जाए। आप सबकी सहमति से मैं अफ्रीकन यूनियन के अध्यक्ष को G20 के स्थायी सदस्य के रूप में अपना स्थान ग्रहण करने के लिए आमंत्रित करता हूं।
We highly impressed with the manner in which Prime Minister Modi.
Another coup, while not official so far but learned from reliable sources by Times Now, is that India has succeeded in convincing the Quad leaders to be special guests at the Republic Day parade next year. This is a big diplomatic win as it is being perceived as a direct message to China. Combine this with what US President described as the real big deal, a multimodal transport and energy corridor between India and Europe via the Middle East aimed as a counter to China's BRI or the Belt and Road Initiative. And one would but agree with the government that in terms of deliverables, this summit has been the most ambitious ever, with more than a double substantive work done with India at the helm as compared to previous presidencies.
The New Delhi Leaders Declaration has 83 paras in all. Planet, people, peace and prosperity, all those 8 paras have 100% acceptance. All countries have unanimously supported the New Delhi Leaders Declaration. This is one declaration without a single footnote and without any chair's summary. This is a complete statement with 100% unanimity. This demonstrates both the Prime Minister's and India's great ability to bring all developing countries, all emerging markets, all developed countries, China, Russia, everybody together on the same table and bring consensus.
Sushant Sareen, Senior Fellow at Observer Research Foundation, joins us along with Colonel Grant Newsham, retired U.S. Marine, and author Anthony Levesques, Research Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and Andrew K.P. Leung, International and Independent China Strategist. I want to start by asking you, Colonel Grant Newsham, did you expect that there would be success in getting a joint statement? Because at least at home, there were several cynics.
I wasn't entirely surprised, but one does note, of course, that some of the language was watered down. But given the number of participants, given the very contentious issues at stake, I think this is quite an achievement. So say I'm not, sort of jaw-dropping surprised, but at the same time, this was not easy to do, and credit where it's due.
Sushant Sareen, what do you think went into doing this? Was it simply because India had the presidency and they needed to prove people wrong? What was the legwork that went behind making almost the impossible possible?
No, I'm not entirely aware of how much of the legwork went into this, but quite clearly, I think it's a very good consensus document. I don't think it's really watered down. If you read the formulation carefully, they have reiterated, by referring to what was said in Bali, they've reiterated that, and they've brought in a couple of new things into this declaration, and struck a compromise. Nobody has gone easy on Russia. You've referred to by all the other things, but nobody has gone after the Russians, because in some ways that would be counterproductive. Isn't it in everybody's interest that this war ends? And the impact of this war on the global economy, particularly on food supplies, on energy supplies, is minimized to the maximum extent possible. I think it's in everybody's interest. So I think there was better sense which prevailed. There was none of the, and I personally think, Padmaja, that everybody kind of negotiated from a maximalist position and then came down to a compromise formula.
And
because if you look at what has happened in previous...
Indians would be perfectly justified in arguing that this is full credit to the Indian Sherpas, to the negotiators, and to the Indian presidency, that they have managed to negotiate people down from their maximalist position, clearly showing India is no pushover.
No, absolutely. I think the credit does go to the Indian diplomats who were, channeling the entire negotiation process. I think that's a no-brainer. But I also think what has happened is that, countries which were taking, please remember, Padmaja, in the previous, there was the finance ministers meeting, there were a couple of other meetings, and no consensus document came out of that. What happened was that, you gave a sense of the meeting or an outcome statement, but there was no declaration from some of the previous meetings which were held, partly because Ukraine was a sticking point. So every side was negotiating very hard. And I think the credit does go to the Indian diplomats who kind of, narrowed down everybody's differences to a point where you could come up with a consensus document. That is what diplomacy is all about ultimately, isn't it?
Bob Blackman, what do you make of India's presidency and what has been achieved? Your sense of the joint statement, and not just that, also the Global Biofuels Alliance and the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. Quite a full plate, you'd agree, in terms of outcomes.
Well, I'm just listening to your other contributors, and the fact is this is certainly a triumph for Indians' diplomacy. It certainly is unique to hear a communique announced on the first day of the bilaterals taking place. Normally, these things, if they do get an agreement amongst nations, it's normally right at the end when it's last knocking. So this is a tremendous achievement by India. Clearly, we don't know all the details behind the scenes of what lobbying has taken place by Indian diplomats of various different members, but clearly it's been very successful. I can understand a compromise being reached over the illegal invasion by Russia into Ukraine and the disgraceful war that they've launched against the Ukrainians. I can understand why naturally supporters of people that tend to lean towards Russia would not wish to give a complete condemnation of Russia, but it's a sad that they haven't done so, frankly, because the risk to the world order is that Russia has invaded a sovereign country without justification whatsoever, and indeed the war continues. This is clearly having a dramatic effect on energy supplies worldwide, clearly having an effect on the world grain market, which is terrible. And actually, for India, it's having a terrible effect as well in terms of production. So I think that there's certain things here that could have been strengthened. I think there's very good news about the Middle East accords that are taking place and the arrangements that are now coming together. But I think there's the other side effect, which is almost to sideline and isolate China from this, which I think is another major coup for Indian diplomacy, because there is a concern that China, as a faltering economy, but has been a fast developing economy, was potentially going to dominate this. Clearly, they've been sidelined, and that's good news, I think, for world order overall.
Okay, so I want to address those issues one by one. First, Sushant Sareen, the shadow of disappointment that Russia wasn't singled out, named and shamed.
Yeah, I know.
What would have come out of it? Supposing you had come out with a statement where you had, condemned them in the strongest of terms, what would have been the result? Would the invasion have ended? Would the fighting have stopped? I don't think so. Look, people have to understand around the world that engagement isn't necessarily endorsement. Many countries engage with each other without necessarily endorsing the actions or the lack of actions of other countries. And that is one of the principles of diplomacy, that you have to engage with other countries. Secondly, on the energy supply business, look, if you take out the Russian energy supplies from the market today, what would happen to energy supplies? Number one, there would be massive shortages, which would be devastating for the global economy, including economies like India, and the prices would spike. And it's not as though European countries have stopped buying Russian energy as of now. They're continuing to buy Russian energy. And I can understand why, because if they were not going to do it, then, their economies come to a grinding halt. So one is that. On the China question, look, I think the Chinese have isolated themselves. I don't think the Indians have done any such thing. If the Chinese thought that they are going to play this game and, they are the big dog in the room and they are the guys without whom nothing will move forward, clearly that's not happened. The party has gone ahead. The party has been, so far at least, an extremely successful party. It's raining in Delhi, which means it's an auspicious thing. The gods are smiling. The weather is good. So yeah, everything is looking good, and frankly, I think had the Chinese been out here, it would have been useful for them. But by not coming out here and by behaving in a petulant manner, what have they achieved? Ultimately, you've come out with an alternative to the so-called BRI project. Okay, it might be still on the drawing board, but I think it's the audacity of ambition and vision of that project is quite remarkable. To bring in countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, some very pivotal European countries, the US, Japan, India, all onto a single platform to get into this massive developmental project. And the name of it is a partnership. It's not a weirdly named Belt and Road Initiative. Nobody knows what the belt is. Nobody knows what the road is, and nobody knows what the initiative is. But you're talking about a partnership for global infrastructure and investment. It's a partnership. It's not a predatory kind of an approach. And I think that is the alternate vision which these countries are showing to the world. If the Chinese are missing out on it, just too bad.
Andrew Leung, before the G20 summit started, there were 2 points of view. One was the snarky one, where people said, it's a no-show by Xi Jinping. There's a long shadow of his absence, which is going to be there over the summit. And the other, which was enunciated by one of our ministers, they said it's entirely their loss. Look at the joint statement, and you would agree that at the end of the day, it is China's loss.
I think the optics of having a joint statement and having a compromise are excellent for India. They're a very clear win for Indian diplomacy, Indian statecraft, but also for the wider rules-based international order and its supporters. I think the jury is still out, I think, on the backstory of how that compromise was reached, and I'm sure in the next few days we'll hear more about how that happened and the very practical role Indian diplomacy played in this. I also think we can expect to see some individual country debriefs of how that took place and how there might be some daylight between that statement and individual perspectives. But it's very clear in my mind that the optics of reaching an agreement are fantastic for India. It demonstrates this ability of India as a major global player to really bring countries together on terms which India decided for itself.
Andrew Leung?
Well, thank you. It's not true to say that as China's lost. In fact, China is represented. China is not absent. I mean, President Xi is represented by the premier. He's a very close confidant. And I think that China never intends to be the spanner in the works because China embraces the globalization with a vengeance. Letting alone sort of decoupling, de-risking. China is the greatest is the largest trading partner for 128 countries in the world, compared with only 58 for the United States. So China embraces globalization. China, of course, is very important in the global south, as demonstrated by the recent BRICS summit, where a lot of countries are lining up to join the BRICS. I think that the presidency's absence doesn't distract the fact that A, China is contributing to the solution, and B, and is not intending to be a spoiler in the works, and B, of course, is a testimony to the success of India's diplomacy, because it's really a master stroke. And of course, the diplomacy is the art of the possible. And on such critical issues as the Ukraine war, there was a report that there was some disagreement, but eventually disagreement have disappeared by very skillful maneuvering and use of principles, because no one wants a war. I mean, before, which country wants just say that declares that it wants war all the time? And so all countries would love peace. All countries would like to defend their own national interests. All countries like to respect each other's sovereignty. So these are common principles.
Bob Blackman, how would you respond to the argument that fine, give Indian diplomacy its due, but you're being unnecessarily harsh on China? It's a part of the solution, not the problem.
Well, China is obviously a major economy. I mean, it's across the world. And as has been said, it's a major trading partner for so many different countries. The reality is that the human rights position in China is pretty desperate. I mean, if you're a Uyghur Muslim, you're suffering great hardship, and there's the border disputes with India that China is involved in, and their expansion in various different parts of off their coast to create new atolls to undermine the security of Southeast Asia is well known, well understood, and the threat to countries in that region. So from a security perspective, there's a clear concern. Their Belt and Road Initiative, whether it's understood or not, is basically attempting to recreate the Silk Route, which would flow through Pakistan, through the various different countries, through Eastern Europe to Europe and beyond. And their attempts at colonization in Africa have to be called out. And if we don't call them out, then frankly, we're failing in our duty. The fact that whether they've been chosen to be isolated or whether they have been isolated by India during these talks, I think the reality is that whichever way it's gone, I think it's bad news for China and good news for the rest of the world.
Mr. Leung, there is a fair level of isolation.
Well, I don't think it's a bad news for China at all. I've yet to see the detailed words, but the fact that Li Qiang, the deputy of President Xi, has agreed to it, I don't think it's bad news for China at all. And as far as the China's Belt and Road and the alternative of this so-called partnership, I mean, the test of the pudding is in the eating. I mean, there's a great deal of common grounds, a great deal of principles. But the big difference between the Belt and Road, which has signed up for hundreds of projects, and a large part of this are happening, and of course are being reformed all the time to take into account various concerns. So I think the test of the pudding eventually is in the eating. But it's a good thing that there are alternatives for countries to choose. One thing that marks the China different from the former globalization, as it were, and also institutions like the IMF, is that there are strings attached which are not found very comfortable with a lot of recipient countries, because each country's politics are different, each country's culture and civilization is different, and some countries felt compelled, I mean, the developing South, compelled into agreeing certain things which the other would not have agreed had they been in a better bargaining position. And now with this the G20 statement and the involvement of both China and India, I think that the Global South is giving a shot in the arm. In fact, according to various research, the developing countries are going to account for something like more than 50% of the world GDP by the year 2035 using purchasing power parity measurements. So I think that we're seeing a shift in the global order away from a Western-dominated kind of scenario, with ushering in a more equitable and more balanced world order.
But who is that world order shifting towards?
Well, the world order should work for the welfare of the people rather than the elite, because if you look at the world is very, very inequitable. The richest 50% of the population, the poorest 50% of the population control only 8% of the income, and vice versa. So the world is extremely unequal. And a lot of the poor countries, they do not have access to adequate finance. Then their companies are compelled to follow certain rules dictated by Western investors. So I think that this is the rise of the Global South. The reason behind this is to just address this huge inequality and inequity.
Colonel Newsham, is the unnecessarily harsher glare, which the suggestion is that it's unnecessarily harsh because the world order is shifting and is shifting away from the West, which is why this whole narrative of China was isolated, it was a message to China, China was sidelined in the G20 summit. They're saying, great, the rest of you want to cooperate, it's a great thing. But it's not as if China was left out in the woods.
Well, China was not isolated. President Xi made a conscious decision not to attend, but he's so strongly represented by his premier. And as I said, China did contribute to the discussion and did contribute ideas to the solution. Now, I don't think China is isolated at all.
Well, I think if you have to explain why you weren't there, that you probably slipped up, and not by Xi Jinping not being there. That is it's a loss. You can't help that. But the shift away from the West, I've been hearing that for 40, 50 years. Perhaps it's a little bit of a shift toward countries which have consensual government, which have elections, which have some rudimentary concept of human rights. In terms of the Global South's problems, so much of that has to do with domestic corruption. And often that is aided and abetted by some of their international partners. Everyone knows it's part and parcel of Belt and Road Initiative projects to have any amount of under-the-table payments made. Western banks, their cooperation in laundering all of this money shouldn't go untouched, mentioned as well. So just a few comments.
I don't know if you can see Mr. Leung, but he's looking very amused at your suggestion.
Well, fair enough.
I think have this rhetoric,
open the books. But open the concentration camps.
If I'm allowed to respond, I'm not amused by this, but in fact, this is a very interesting debate. Whether democracy is the solution for all, obviously not. Because if you look at the recent research by the Harvard Kennedy School 2 years ago, the most recent research by the Edelman Trust Barometer, EDELMAN, based in New York, and the research Ipsos, IPSOS, based in Paris, they all confirm that the government or the country most supported by these people is not some Western countries. China is amongst the countries best supported by these people, because the Chinese people's livelihood have been miraculously transformed for the past 40 years. So this is not to say that China's model will suit everyone, but I think that equally true that democracy is not a magic wand.
Well, you know, miraculous, I'm not entirely sure many of the Chinese people would agree. Sure, they may not understand what hit them, but miracles, not so sure. Sushant Sareen, you want to weigh in? And then I want to go back to Anthony Leveskis. Yes.
No, for an autocratic, totalitarian state to claim that it enjoys the support of the people, I think it's very rich coming from these guys. If indeed they enjoyed so much support, why not have free and fair elections? We'll find out what exactly the situation is. But that's a needless debate. You know, the Chinese have decided what kind of a system they want. From our point of view, Padmaja, I think it's very important, you know, when Mr. Leung says that the taste of the pudding is in the eating, to some extent he's right. And in fact, when it comes to the BRI projects, a lot of people have eaten that poisonous fruit and have found out that it's extremely bitter. And the fact of the matter is that please tell me one country where these projects have come up which has actually improved the lives of the people in that country. Sri Lanka, Pakistan, where, you know, look at the kind of electricity tariffs people have to pay. Most of the Chinese companies are simply refusing to accept any change or any reform in the kind of contracts they have signed. The Pakistanis are having to pay through their nose for some of the energy which the Chinese projects are generating. I'm not absolving the Pakistanis. And this is where I agree to some extent with what Colonel Newsham said about, you know, the kind of corruption which has gone into some of these projects. The kind of returns that were promised to the Chinese, 27% return on equity. Where does this happen? How does that make those projects affordable? The kind of interest rates that they've had to pay on the kind of debts which have been taken, and then what is the kind of impact that's had on the local society? Has it led to jobs? Has it led to new technologies coming in? How has it improved the lives of the people? It hasn't, and that's a fact. And forget Pakistan. Okay, Pakistan is a client state, so we can write it off. Let's talk about Africa. The kind of white elephant projects that have come in Africa or in some parts of Central Asia, they're unaffordable, they are unsustainable, they are unviable. That's not development, right? That is what has led to this concept of debt trap diplomacy. And clearly, if you're trying to, and frankly, I would even go to the extent of saying that some of these studies which are being quoted, I don't know how much Chinese money had a role to play in some of those studies. How much of it was sponsored? Because we've heard all kinds of stories coming out of US universities and British universities for that matter. And maybe Mr. Blackman can tell us on the kind of influence
I want to stop you for just a second because we've got the statement now. I've got the statement now. You know, we were comparing the European-Indian Middle East corridor as compared to the Belt and Road Initiative, and now we've got details of the statement, and it says very, very clearly that the India, USA, UAE, Saudi Arabia, France, Germany, Italy and European Union have signed the Memorandum of Understanding to establish the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. It will encourage and provide impetus to economic development through enhanced connectivity and economic integration between Asia, West Asia, Middle East and Europe. But here's the important part. It says, and please listen to this, this is very, very important, and this is the breaking news right now. It says that connectivity with countries of the region, near or far, remains a key priority for India, is deep-rooted in Indian civilizational history. India has always stood to invest, cooperate and build connectivity as part of One Earth, One Family, one future, and then goes on to say that the initiative should be consultative, transparent, and participatory with respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries. Bob Blackman. The operative part is that it says very, very clearly, we are participating in the corridor, but there has to be respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the initiative should be consultative, transparent, and participatory, not China coming into your territory with its engineers and essentially employing your people as laborers to build their road.
This is a great initiative that means that the sovereignty of each country will be protected, and indeed it will be a conciliatory process by which people will join in and participate, rather than have China come in and say, we'll give you anything you want as long as you give us your mineral rights and you give us your workers. This is a totally different type of operation to encourage world growth, basically, growth in the economy across the various different nations involved. And that to me is the way that world trade should grow. We all want to see world trade growing. I want to see growth in the economy. We want to see the growth to be spread out and the potential wealth created to be spread across the world rather than concentrated in tiny pockets. And I think this is one of those areas where there'll be something to gain for everyone, and that's key. I mean, obviously, you all know the United Kingdom is negotiating with India on the potential for a free trade deal, which will be the first free trade deal that India has done. This, to me, by the words you've just described, suggests this is India trying to open up the world to trade in a full participatory manner to the benefit of everyone involved. And that, to me, is the way that you encourage and promote growth on a democratic basis. And I just come back to this issue about whether autocracy, democracy, or the right way of operating is the key. I think the world is full of dictatorships which are far from beneficial and benign. And the reality is that the great attraction of democracy is that the people decide who they want as their leaders, who they want to see governing, and have the opportunity to change that government if they don't think they're doing any good. In an autocracy or some sort of dictatorship, they don't. And so you end up with, unfortunately, forced revolutions effectively taking place. And that normally involves the military turning on the leadership of the country. So to me, this is bringing together the democracies of the world in a way of achieving world growth. And I'm sure our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who's obviously in India at the moment, will be delighted with hearing that as a proposed way forward, because it's precisely the sort of approach that the United Kingdom has taken. Now we're outside of the European Union and is wanting to promote world trade in that way.
Mr. Liu, your comments, especially on the wording, where it says you have development, you improve trade, you improve ties, but please respect and a mutual respect for territorial integrity of each participating nation. That's how democracies function.
I think it's very interesting that a normative wrapping has been given to this major transnational initiative announced at the favor of India's G20 summit and the importance of the diplomatic work India did to lead to this. The normative aspects aside, I think there's a huge demand for infrastructure covering the whole arc of geography, which the MOU is discussing. And I think the West in general has taken some late actions, notably at the G7, also wrapped in that sort of normative discussion around democracy and transparency. And this is hugely important. In that sense, the initiative unveiled at the G20 in Delhi is a step forward. It's a supplementary, significant step to really widen the basis of what has been discussed in the G7 group in response to the BRI. I should say that implementation will be really quite long drawn out, just as the BRI has been. You can only start deciding whether the BRI has been effective and whether it's been a net positive or net negative 10 years hence, which is now. And I think there will be a very important piece for India, but also for all the countries involved in this initiative around expectations management to their own public, about their own diplomacy, but also for the third-party beneficiaries of this initiative. And I think, lastly, that we should remember that this is all a catch-up game with what China initiated about 10 years ago. It's a belated move from a host of countries in subscribing broadly to a sort of Indo-Pacific outlook. That is a competitive outlook to China's. But we shouldn't forget that China itself has learned from its own shortcomings in the BRI, and it has adapted. And one of the manifestations of adaptation has been the Global Development Initiative it unveiled a couple of years ago. And it's only now becoming clear that this is a higher plane at which China expects to be playing. And this will have momentous consequences globally in terms of not just physical infrastructure, but also digital infrastructure. And so I think it's very important to look at how implementation, both of the GDI for China and this new initiative for G20 countries, will actually take place. And I think it will be important to keep track of specific projects and how the sum of these projects amount to a whole, which individual countries or small groupings of countries could not have achieved otherwise.
Well, in fact, we're just getting the first pictures of the American president. He's reached for the gala dinner hosted by the president of India at Bharat Mandapam. Interesting backdrop also we have of the Nalanda ruins, which of course was the seat of learning in ancient Bharat. And the Prime Minister quite obviously is there explaining the significance of this backdrop to US President Joe Biden. Also interesting, and perhaps Sushant Sareen, you would want to listen to this. We've just got details of the menu as well. So a lot of emphasis on millets, or Shriyan, as it is referred to by the Prime Minister. The starters apparently something called patram, which is dahi ke gole or bhartiya masaledar chutney se saje kangni Shri An leaf crisps. I mean, sounds a little bit like dahi bhalla, pardon me. But then there is one varnam, which is the mains, and it is glazed forest mushrooms, Shriyan again, which is millets, Shriyan crisp, and curry patte, this curry leaves, and you have got red rice from Kerala, and you've got kathal gallets, which I'm assuming is some kind of preparation, a vegetable preparation. Interesting choice in the menu, but entirely vegetarian. Rishabh is joining us from Bharat Mandapam. Hardly any surprise that there is a lot of emphasis on the millet menu, entirely vegetarian. Still seems quite fancy to me. I mean, I don't really have much knowledge of food, but could you decode some of this for us? It says, Tazi hawa ka jhoka, mitti ke gun. What's the messaging? What's the idea here, Rishabh? What is this menu?
Well, this is a menu that definitely is unique. India has been celebrating the millet year, the national year for millets, and G20, we have seen meetings after meetings that millet foods have been served. But did we expect a purely vegetarian food at the heads of state, heads of government dinner? That is quite surprising. And when most of the heads of state who are visiting are openly non-vegetarian, this menu is something that is very Indian to them. The palate that they are going to have is going to leave them with some memories for sure. Even here at India International Media Center, we have been looking at food, and the food is millet-oriented, vegetarian for last 48 hours since we are packed up here at IMC as well. So the menu doesn't look very surprising, Padmaja, but definitely it is definitely someone who would be decoding it, standing there, whoever is taking it in the plate.
Sushant Sareen, what's a jackfruit galette? It sounds rather fancy. I've never eaten it though.
Padmaja, if I was called to a restaurant serving this, I would not have gone, frankly speaking. I love my tandoori chicken, and I love my hamburgers, and I love my non-vegetarian food. But look, here is the thing. Millets have been traditionally the cereal of India, right? Rice, of course, but also millets. And I think what the government has been doing is, and some of it is related to climate change as well. Millet crops are far more hardy, are able to withstand, climate changes much better than crops like wheat. So I think there is a concerted push towards this. You are bringing it onto the high table, where you're serving international dignitaries this food. Look, I'm sure it'll be very good, right? It'll be completely unusual, completely unique, something almost all of them would have never had. So it's a completely new cuisine which is being served. And I don't have a problem with that. Personally, I would order this in a restaurant, but I think it's a statement which is being made.
Oh, 100%. 100%. I would love to eat it. Not that anyone's calling me for this dinner, but if only somebody would tell me what a galette is. I still don't know what that is. Also, interesting statement in what is being made on the drinks in offer. You've got a Kashmiri kahwa, which is of course from Kashmir. You've got filter coffee, which is almost synonymous with Tamil Nadu, with Kerala, and then you've got Darjeeling chai, which is from the east of the country. So you've got a fair sprinkling of from north to south to east. I think you wanted to say something, Sushant.
I would prefer my Scotch whiskey any day.
I don't think we're allowed to say this on national TV, but anyway, it's a Saturday, so I'll let that pass. Final words, Bob Blackman. Tomorrow your Prime Minister is going to be visiting the Akshardham temple. Have you mastered yet the art of saying Jai Siya Ram?
Jai Sri Ram. I've been to Akshardham on a couple of occasions on visits. I've had the pleasure of visiting India, and I've actually visited 15 of the Indian states. So I'm well travelled in India. And I think the one Prime Minister who will love the menu, of course, is Rishi Sunak, because he not only is a practicing Hindu, but also he's a vegetarian as well. So he will. I'm not sure if he has millet on his normal agenda for his food, but certainly he will be well at home. And Akshardham, of course, is modelled. This is a classic. Akshardham is modelled on the world famous Neasden Mandir in London, which was built before Akshardham was created. Akshardham is just bigger and has a bigger footprint and enables more Hindus to practice from the Swaminarayan Hindu cause. So yes, he will be going there for and paying a great visit to there. I'm sure he and Prime Minister Modi will have excellent bilateral discussions and hopefully move our trade deal even further forward to get the details in place so that we can finally get this going. That's been long promised and it's been a lot of very detailed work. And obviously the Indian diplomats that have been working on this, together with the UK diplomats, have been working very extended hours. So I hope that's going to bring things to fruition.
Well, the best conversations and the best deals are always struck on a full stomach. So let's hope this is a really, really good dinner. On that very fond note, I'm going to leave all of you gentlemen. Thanks very much for sparing time on a Saturday night or a Saturday morning, depending on which part of the world you're in. I'll leave you to your next meal. Thanks very much for joining me, and thanks for watching.